Hello everybody, today I'm going to be giving you my potentially controversial take on by far the most dramatic event in the world of cars last week. Now, just in case you're not aware of what it is that I'm talking about, it is of course the crashing of not just one, but two Ferrari F40s in the space of what felt like only a few days. First off, a fairly big incident here at home, where a car on a test drive with a technician while it was in for some work suffered a major accident. And the second, a little further away, where Lando Norris's own personal F40, so the story goes, was spun, though happily, with much less severe consequences. And of course, this has led to the internet bursting into life with expert opinions. And before I give you mine, I shall give you my credentials. First off, and perhaps most significantly, I have never driven an F40. And therefore I consider my opinion to be worth less of that than anybody who has. Problem is though, I have spoken to a lot of people that have either driven or owned an F40. And the fact is, their opinion is split down the middle. Some loved it, some hated it. And in fact, they both came to their conclusions for the same reason. The F40 has a now very well-known reputation for being a fairly spiky and demanding thing. And of course, it is this reputation which in the eyes of many makes it the greatest supercar of all time. Now, it's already got a Ferrari badge on it, it is an iconic looking thing, and just about anybody with even a vague interest in the world of cars would know an F40 at 200 paces. But there is this persistent notion that a proper supercar, in order to earn that title, must be inherently difficult to drive. And for some, not only that, but it should have no aids to then help you if you make a mistake. For after all, we should all suffer the consequences of our own actions. And while I can see some sort of logic for this, today I'd like to provide a little bit of a counter to it. Now, some of my relevant experience is in driving not the F40 or sadly the F50. I was offered to go in both, but my insurance company said no, so I'm still waiting for that opportunity, which I expect may never come. I have, however, driven many other supercars across the years, including those that came both before and after the F40. So in the recent era, I've driven things up to and including the Ferrari 296, the Lamborghini Aventador, the Huracan, Gallardo, Murcielago, Diablo, Countach. I've also driven many of the other Ferrari lineup, including the front-engined V12 stuff, which I know I don't consider a supercar, but for the purposes of today's topic, it is, and some cool classic stuff too, like the old Ferrari 512BB, the 308, 328, Testarossa. I've driven a lot of cars. I've driven cars with more power than the F40 and F50. I've driven cars with less power. I've driven a lot of stuff. I've driven cars spanning a 100-year period. And something I do want to say, I do not consider myself an expert driver. Somebody at a Porsche meet once asked me, what exactly is it that qualifies you to tell me about a car? The answer is very, very simple. Nothing. I've just driven lots and lots of cars. I consider my skills to be in camera work, lighting, and editing. As far as I see it, my job is not to push the car to the ragged edge, because that would be a stupid idea on the public roads. Instead, it is to try and initiate a dialogue with the car and see what it feels like, how much it talks back to me, and whether it's something that you can enjoy within the confines of the road. I am very, very well aware of the fact that the majority of cars I drive, I do not push as hard as they could possibly be pushed, because that would be a stupid thing to do. First off, it's illegal in the vast majority of cases, but secondly, if you do that, you leave yourself no margin for error. And there have been a few occasions, it's very, very rare, only happened I think maybe twice, where I have either not taken on a review or cancelled a review because I've looked at the car and thought, you know, I don't think that's actually suitable for the public roads, or more accurately, I don't think I'm going to actually derive any enjoyment out of that thing. I've been on a number of top speed days on airfields and things like that, where I've seen people struggling to keep a car in a straight line, a car that they own and they know, simply because it's got so much power in it and it is delivered in a fairly abrupt fashion. And it's that second part which I think is really important when it comes to talking about the Ferrari F40. Now, the Ferrari F40 makes a claimed 480 horsepower. I know people will tell you actually in reality it makes a bit more. It's really faster than the F50, and it has about 420 pounds-feet of torque. That's getting on for nearly 600 newton meters. Those would be good numbers now. In the late 1980s, when the car launched, they were incredible. But here's the thing. There is a big difference between 1980s horsepower and modern horsepower. And it is really all in the delivery and, of course, the way the car then responds to said delivery. If you look at a dyno graph of a Ferrari F40, you will see that up to about 3,000 RPM, it's not really making that much power at all. But then, over the space of around about 1,000 RPM, if that, it makes another 300 horsepower. This is nearly two-stroke power delivery. This is a lot of power arriving very suddenly. And all that really keeps the rear end of an F40 in check is a pair of huge rear tyres, a limited slip differential, and the judicious application of the driver's right foot, which of course, to just about everybody currently commenting on Facebook, should be more than enough. But it's just not. And here is my take on what has happened in at least one of these incidents. The rumour is that the car was in for some sort of repair work, potentially relating to the turbochargers. So somebody went out with the aim of making sure that the car was delivering power as it should. And judging by the video evidence, I would say that the garage definitely fixed the car for at least about 10 minutes. Now, when I heard that this car had gone off the road, before I even saw the footage, I'd seen the pictures of the aftermath, and then it didn't look pretty. If anything, seeing the video told me that I don't think the person driving was actually being all that stupid. I was half expecting to see a car being driven beyond what it really should have been, certainly in the hands of somebody who didn't own it. But that's not what happened. The car is simply going along on the public road. You can hear that the throttle has been applied, the revs have climbed, and then after a moment the car breaks loose and then goes off. And unfortunately, in this incident, it catches first a curb, then rolls into a lamppost. Does masses of damage. It's not actually even a particularly high-speed incident. But because of the way an F40 is put together, the car effectively fell apart. These, I know, are many people's dream supercar, but there is one area where I'm afraid the Ferrari haters have got it right. They're not particularly clever things. They are not particularly fancy in the way they are constructed. The F50 is a marvel. Even by modern standards, the F50 really is near unique in the way it's put together. It's built around a carbon fibre tub with an engine bolted Formula One style directly to the back of it, and all the components then bolted to the engine. It's fantastic. Seeing an F50 having its clutch done is magnificent because the car is effectively sheared in half so they can get access to what they need to. An F40, by comparison, is positively old-fashioned, even in the context of the 1990s. It's just a bunch of steel tubes. Now, I know people say, no, but the F40 is a carbon fibre car, or carbon Kevlar construction. The body panels are, but the chassis is not. Now, the worst kept secret in the entire world is that my buddy Scott has got an F40 project on the go. In case you don't know who I'm talking about, you may know him as Rata Rossa. And for a long time, the good people at Pistonheads have been wondering what sort of abomination it is that he's putting together in his garage. But I and several others have known for a long time that what Scott actually has is a real F40. I am so excited for this build, and I know he is desperate to get the car together. But thanks to Scott, I can show you exactly what it is that lurks underneath those carbon Kevlar panels of an F40. Yeah, it's not particularly substantial, is it? And it's not a car that I would like to have an accident in. I mean, to be honest, I don't really want to have an accident in an F40 for a whole variety of different reasons. The first of which being that it'd be very embarrassing, and if you are driving an F40, somebody will almost certainly be filming it, and I can't really afford to fix it. Even if I did get it insured, the excess is probably going to be eye-watering. An F50, meanwhile, much better, much more advanced, but I still don't want to crash it for many of the same reasons. The point I'm trying to make here, this is not a sophisticated car. This is not a particularly clever thing. Really, it is just a great big, oversized go-kart. And I know, I can hear it already. Lots of people saying, yeah, but James, go-karts are the ultimate handling tool. They are brilliant. They are amazing. Yes, they are. They're fantastic. They're wonderful, especially if you know how to properly pedal one. But they do like to rotate on occasion very suddenly and sometimes without too much provocation if they've got the right amount of power, if the conditions aren't quite on your side. I used to own a 944 Turbo S, a late 1980s Porsche, and this had about half the power of an F40. That also had very similar 1980s turbo power delivery. Nothing, everything in the space of a very few RPM. One of the reasons that I sold that car was because I wanted to use it all year round. Winter was approaching, and I just knew there was no way that this car and I were likely going to survive a winter without having at least a moment. I then replaced it with a 968, which made very similar power, but because it was naturally aspirated, was much more controllable and much simpler. Today, I own a Ferrari F50, which came out about 10 years after the F40, but it has a similar amount of power and a similar amount of torque. It is, though, a naturally aspirated V12, meaning that the power is far more linear and easily controllable, and it has traction control. Now, it's very basic traction control. It's some of Ferrari's first, and I don't trust it. And I don't trust it because I have found out on a few occasions that it's not very good. There are lots and lots of stories out there from the likes of Harry Metcalf, who dailied a 550 for a long time, of the fact that in the wrong conditions, and by wrong conditions I mean anything that's not 20 degrees plus and dry, the 550 has the ability to spin its rear tyres in third gear, maybe even fourth. These are seriously potent cars, and we have now become accustomed to cars that are a little easier, a little more controllable. And this is the other part of this debate, because I've already had a few comments from people telling me, yeah, well, James, you see, if everybody learned to drive in an old school car with no traction control, no driver aids, and poor tyres, then they'd know how to handle something when it went wrong. Well, to that, I want to say a couple of things. There is always, when people talk about this sort of stuff, a subtle implication that somebody who learnt to drive in a 1970s car will somehow be a better driver than somebody who learns to drive in a modern one, complete with all of its many driver aids. The fact is that in normal, ordinary driving conditions today, there shouldn't really be any need for you to require any of the driver aids, especially if you're in something that weighs 1.5 tons and only has 100 horsepower. ABS, I suspect, is the one that you really want more than anything else. And that, by the way, is also something that the F40 does not have. I've seen articles with people that have, say, McLaren F1s. Rowan Atkinson said it would be nice if the car had a little bit of help, particularly in terms of the brakes, because in a panic, all of this internet commentary, all of these people analysing every detail, every angle, well, you weren't there, you weren't in that situation. It drives me sometimes absolutely mad when you watch the Formula One and you see an incident, particularly at the first corner, where somebody's come together with somebody else and there's this whole analysis about who was right, who was wrong, and sometimes it's pretty clear. But you know something? If you've ever even sat in a single-seater, you'll realise pretty quickly that the visibility in them is pretty darn poor. You're sat almost on the floor, you've got a lot around you, and at the start of a race there's going to be a huge amount going on, and sometimes you might not even be aware that somebody is right here behind you, and if you saw them you maybe only had a fraction of a second to react. You had to make a decision, and in those circumstances you will go on your instinct. Racing drivers, of course, will have lots and lots and lots of training to try and dial out what are our instincts, and this is why they are a superior breed. I think just about everybody commenting would like to believe that if it was them at the wheel of one of these F40s, they'd have styled it out like Chris Harris and got it done absolutely perfectly. They'd be the hero of the internet. Look at this absolute legend slithering along in their F40. Aren't they brilliant? Thing is though, most of us aren't Chris Harris, are they? And if I did see Chris Harris slithering an F40 down the public road, I wouldn't be particularly impressed either. And I'm pretty sure there is a reason that he would pick and choose his moments when to have fun in one of these cars. Incidentally, if you haven't seen the video from the drive from years and years ago with an F40 and an F50 on track, it's one of the best pieces of YouTube car cinema out there. It's just sensational and a wonderful treat to get to see these things at full tilt, which is something that today is sadly very, very rare. And it's interesting that as time has gone on, the opinion of the F40, the general consensus, seems to have changed. Because 25 years ago, when I was a younger man, I remember an F40 could be had for about £180,000. Today, they're worth something like 10 times that, sometimes even more. An F50 back then was only a little more, £250,000 to £300,000, and those now are £3 to £4 million cars. I remember very, very vividly that one of my dad's friends thought about buying an F40. He went down to the dealership, took it out, drove it down the road, 5 minutes later came back and said, "It's horrible, I hate it, I don't want one." I have met several people that have had F40s and said, "I just don't like it. It's not really a very pleasant thing. It's not even easy to get into." It wasn't until I tried to get into one that I realised what a big high sell they have in them. Lotus Elise owners, you actually have it potentially even easier. But as these cars have become worth even more and even more, two things have happened. First off, everybody now seems to say they are the bestest thing ever, which 20 years ago they didn't. And without having driven one, I just couldn't give you my opinion on that. But I can tell you for certain the other thing that's happened. These cars, they're not being driven as much. Now, the example here in Britain that got crashed is allegedly one of the world's most used F40s. But I did a quick check, because you would, wouldn't you? It's got 70,000 kilometres currently showing on the odometer. But since COVID, it's only done a matter of a few hundred. It hasn't really gone all that far. That's normal for an F40. This is just what happens with the things. And when this accident happened, my very, very first guess was that the car was probably on old tyres. Ferrari owners, more than maybe any others, are the worst for not putting tyres on their cars. I have had people bring me cars for review that have just come from a service, which in some cases have near 20-year-old tyres on them. One Ferrari came to me with 17-year-old tyres, another 15-year-old tyres, another 11-year-old tyres. And these are all cars where to get tyres for them isn't actually particularly difficult. The F40, I expect, is a little trickier, but because, as these things go, it's relatively commonplace, then you can get them. You can still get tyres for a Countach, if for no other reason than Pirelli know there is a market for them and you are going to pay. But having experience of my own car, the 550, when I got that, it had 6-year-old tyres on it, and to be perfectly honest, in wet conditions, it was terrifying. Without any power and without even very much speed, there were a couple of times where at about 15 to 20 mile an hour, I just started going sideways. I nearly put the car into the side of a lorry because they didn't indicate correctly. I was going around the roundabout and it then turned out we both wanted to go the same way and the car just started drifting over. It's a basic thing. It's a simple car by today's standards. When the tyres are old, the suspension is not up to much and the traction control is basic, in that circumstance, I will admit, I was very lucky. I wasn't going particularly quick because I was already very cautious and wary of the fact that the tyres weren't that great, and even so, apparently, I overestimated how much grip the car had. Now, I'm not exactly sure when this incident here in Britain with the F40 happened, but for those who don't live here, over the last few weeks, it has been incredibly cold. The highest temperature that I've seen is about 7 degrees. And on a number of days, it's only been maybe at most, perhaps 2 or 3. Now, I do know where this car had come from, and I'm fairly certain I know the road on which it was driving. And if my theory is correct, the car wouldn't have travelled particularly far from where it had started, meaning that even if the tyres weren't old, they were cold. The car also didn't look to be travelling at a particularly high speed. The F40 is geared very, very long. Remember, this is a car that did 201 mile an hour with just 5 speeds. I'm fairly confident those watching haven't driven an F40 in real life, but you might have driven one in a video game, and so you've probably in some small way experienced this. By modern standards, it's a really quite bizarre thing. Now, I have driven one of the F40's contemporaries, which is the Jaguar XJ220. It came out a little bit later, but I have experienced old school turbo boost and long gearing. It makes them kind of tricky to drive when you're trying to go slow. These just weren't built for it. And it looks like this car was in one of the lower gears. The driver put their foot down, the car reached to boost, and when it did, the revs will have gone up. The speed of the rear wheels will have risen dramatically. The limited slip differential for a little while did its job, but then there was a sudden lift off, the car kicked sideways, and at that point, I don't think there was probably much chance of recovering it. Now, had the road been a little wider, a little clearer, it would have been simply a brown trouser moment. But unfortunately, as we've seen now, the events unfolded the way that they did, and I am quite confident that we're probably going to hear a fair bit more about this because this is not going to be an easy or simple fix, and I expect a very, very large argument is currently underway. To give you some sort of context of the ludicrous prices of F40 parts, I've been told that an exchange engine for an F40 is £750,000. It's nuts. Everything on an F40 is stupendously priced. And sadly, this is one of those Ferraris where there aren't really many places you can just use a part from something else. A lot of it is bespoke to the F40. You can't even reuse other Ferrari parts. There is naturally, generally, just one source of these parts, and they know you want it for an F40, and they know if you're building an F40, well, you're going to have to pay because the car is worth 2 million quid. So if it costs £1 million to fix it, pony up. Anyway, that is a problem for somebody else. And if I'm being perfectly honest, I think as soon as that driver left that workshop, they were doomed. In an ideal world, they would have been able to sit on the car, wait for a couple of months until it warmed up, maybe go somewhere where the car could be going a little quicker, because if you're already starting at a higher speed, this extra power and extra speed isn't going to be quite so ruinous. I mean, let's face it, if you boot a car in first versus booting a car in fourth at 70, the effect is quite different. But that's not what happened, and I'm sure this was not expected by the driver, and I'm fairly confident they weren't trying to be reckless. I've seen 100 different stories where people tried to do something that they really shouldn't have done in the first place, and it ended badly, and some got lucky. This is not one of those. And the fact is, the F40 here, it's not unique. The Lamborghini Diablo is also a bitey, horrible so-and-so, as is its successor, the Murcielago, which is really a facelift Diablo. I've driven plenty of old-school Ferraris, like the 512 BB, and I had a lot of fun in that car, but I never asked anything of it that I knew it wasn't capable of delivering, and I was likely a little bit overly cautious. I had a great time in a Lamborghini Countach, but there's a very good chance, in fact, no, a certainty, that were I driving a 250 horsepower Porsche Boxster S, I would have been going a lot quicker and with far more confidence. And it's because these cars are not particularly brilliantly engineered. They were built a long time ago using the materials, technology, and know-how of the day, and the simple fact is, we have come a long, long way. It's not just because of the driver aids. I used to love driving my Lotus Evora with all of them off, because it had a chassis that was so supportive of you and so communicative, you had total and complete faith in it. These old supercars, though, they've got big, meaty, spiky engines, sometimes iffy weight distribution, huge tyres that mean when the grip runs out, it runs out in a very sudden and sometimes unpredictable way. If they've not got power steering, you may not be able to correct it quickly enough, and things can go very, very wrong without much warning. I'm lucky enough to have 3 Ferraris, the 550, 430 Scuderia, and the F12. And on paper, the F12 should be the scariest of all to drive in bad conditions, because it's got more power than the other two by some 200 horses plus. It's got more torque than them as well, and because it's front-engined, it doesn't have the innate balance or the grip on the rear that you would get in something mid-engined. Fact is, though, it's actually the one of all of them that I trust the most. I take more liberties when Ferrari give me a press car than I do with some of my own cars. And it's not because I don't care about the press car. In fact, I'd care much, much more about binning a press car than my own. It's because the traction control and technology has come so far that I'm able to put my foot down that little bit more, knowing that if I need it, not only is the traction control there, but it will also intervene in a nice, pleasant, easy manner. And I do drive all of these cars imagining that maybe, just maybe, one day the traction control will not work. I very often see people going out there, particularly in things like BMW M cars, and they'll put their foot down and you can see the car at the back is just not happy, and these people are reliant on the traction control doing its thing. To me, that's not the way to drive any car. And I would love for this idea of people being trained in old school cars to improve the breed as something that would actually work. But let's be honest here, the vast majority of drivers out there don't actually care about driving. They're never ever going to be very good. They want to pass their test so they can go where they want to and back, and that's it. We, the petrol heads who might actually care about car control, about precision, about being able to generate and catch a slide smoothly, we're a real minority. We always have been, and we always will be. And I absolutely do not believe for a second that people growing up with poorly handling cars that would slide around at 5 or 10 miles an hour built a generation that is somehow inherently better at driving. Yes, we do have an issue with modern people relying a little bit too much on electronics. But I also know a whole bunch of people who stacked cars in the 1960s, 70s and 80s. The real difference was that it generally happened at a lower speed and maybe in conditions where it wouldn't today, but also that the consequences of those misfortunes were far more severe. There is only around the corner from me a tale of a man who crashed his Lotus Esprit into a bus stop, and the story goes that he lost his head. Grim thought, isn't it? I know personally of several incidents which definitely did happen, because unfortunately they involved some of my family about 40 or 50 years ago, where people were very, very lucky to survive. And the problem is, a lot of these people talking about this kind of stuff, they're missing the point. Yes, an old Capri 3 litre on cross plies at an icy roundabout, 5-10 mile an hour, hilarious fun, because you don't really need much at all to get the thing going sideways. It's fantastic, it's brilliant, it's wonderful. But I don't think that would prepare anybody for the kind of experience you'd have in an F40. It's a car that generates 4 or 5 times as much power as a lot of the things people are talking about and comparing it to. This is a car that when it bites, will bite you very, very hard. And look, I will always have a bit of admiration and love for the F40. Incidentally, I've never really held it in the same high esteem that many others do. For me, I've always been more of an F50 fan, and once upon a time that was a very, very uncool thing to be, but now the car seems to be a little more universally loved, perhaps because it is now so much more expensive. But having been lucky enough to at least sample, say, the Diablo and the XJ220, these are cars that simply require huge amounts of respect. There is a modern saying, and it goes along the lines of fool around and find out. And the way I enjoy all of these cars is by driving them with respect and a degree of enthusiasm, but never ever asking more of them than I think they are happy to deliver. I've driven a 993 Turbo. It had about the same amount of power as a Ferrari F40. In fact, this one was modified and made a little bit more. It was brilliant, it was amazing, it was hilariously good fun, but it also had all-wheel drive, and I was driving it in the middle of summer on good tyres. That kind of power delivery, in this weather, rear-wheel drive, no driver aids, it was never, ever going to end well. And I do have a degree of sympathy for the driver because, as far as I understand it, they were out there with the express purpose of putting their foot down to make sure that the car worked. It did. I mean, it was glorious, wasn't it, for a little while? About 3 seconds. And then it all went very, very wrong. And I must admit also, I was a little bit upset about the fact that the vast majority of people commenting were interested in the state of the car and not the person driving it. I, for one, am very, very happy that in the one incident nobody was hurt, and in the other the car actually got away fairly lightly. Just needs a rear bumper. That's it. And so, because of all this, and because I don't believe that I am a driving god, if one day that magnificent opportunity comes along to actually get behind the wheel of a Ferrari F40, I am going to try and make sure that it happens in an environment in which I can safely enjoy it. And I will be putting my foot down, but I'll only do it when I am absolutely 100% sure that not only will it be okay, but that if it's not okay, the consequences will be minimal. Because these things need respect. Not because you need to be a manly man to drive an F40, not because it's a car that's so good only driving gods can handle it. It's because it's a car in many ways so bad only driving gods can handle it. Relatively simple construction, relatively simple chassis, lightweight, high power, on paper, best thing ever. In reality, yeah, not always the best recipe. So, there we go. Am I wrong? Am I just some big, soft, southern, shandy-drinking girl's blouse of a reviewer that you've now lost all respect for? Or do you think maybe, just maybe, we should give some people a bit of a break? Because ultimately, there is a reason these things keep getting binned, and 458s don't with the same regularity. It's because they may be just not as good as we would like to think, and we definitely aren't. So, there we go. That's all from me. I want to say a big thanks to all of you for watching, and to my friend Scott, best of luck to you, sir. That's it. Thanks, everybody. Bye now.